Charges unveiled against 3 former Donald Trump aides and associates in the first major public actions by special counsel Robert Mueller. Former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his associate Rick Gates pled not guilty after being indicted on 12 counts by a federal grand jury, including conspiracy against the United States, conspiracy to launder money, and acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign principal. And former campaign policy aide/volunteer George Papadopoulos pled guilty for lying to the FBI. Joining me now to discuss my panel, John Wood, former U.S. attorney, former Deputy Associate Attorney General, and current Hughes Hubbard and Reed LLP partner. Randy Zelin, former prosecutor and currently a criminal defense attorney. Ford O'Connell, the CivicForumPAC chairman and political analyst, along with Kayleigh McEnany, the RNC spokeswoman. John, let me start with you. The Paul Manafort, there are a lot of ways we can go with this, but for me, the bottom line was the headline should be no collusion. You've got someone who's charged with setting up phony accounts, phony companies around the world, going back to 2006, a 31-page indictment, not a single mention of President Trump or the presidential campaign.
Yeah, I think there are really two things that stood out to me about it. One is that there was not any allegation of collusion in the indictment. But the second thing that stood out is that Paul Manafort's in a lot of trouble, and that means that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, has a lot of leverage over him. So if Manafort does know something that is incriminating or harmful to President Trump or the campaign, Manafort now will be highly incentivized to share that information with Mueller and his team and to cooperate. So I think that the two stories that come out of this, first, no allegation of collusion in the indictment itself, but secondly, Mueller's got a lot of power over Manafort.
That's obviously true, but Sarah Huckabee Sanders, during the daily briefing today, echoing the most obvious point here. Again, this was an investigation into Russian collusion, and the media made it about Russia and Donald Trump. Listen to what she had to say.
Today's announcement has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the president's campaign or campaign activity. The real collusion scandal, as we've said several times before, has everything to do with the Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS, and Russia.
Kayleigh, again, we're not going to probably see the headlines, read that, certainly tomorrow morning's newspapers, but that has to be the main thing that stands out here. Manafort is a huge name. These are big monies, the big dollar denominations they're talking about. But again, connecting this to the election, we haven't seen anything yet on that.
There's been none of that. And in fact, in addition to the special counsel, we've had hours and hours of congressional investigation, 100,000 pages of documents reviewed, 10 months of this, and it's come up with nothing. No collusion was the headline today, and it's interesting to see some networks go wall-to-wall coverage with this. When last week, when Hillary Clinton's uranium deal was basically exposed, we know the FBI was investigating Uranium One at the time when all of this happened, or rather Rosatom, who bought Uranium One. No one seemed to care. No one seemed to care about the dossier. There was not this same wall-to-wall coverage. So I understand the frustration of Sarah Huckabee and others that Russia only seems to matter when it's an exculpatory day for the Trump administration, not an inculpatory one, as we saw for the Clintons.
You know, it's interesting, Randy. In fact, just watching headlines in different networks, George Papadopoulos' name kept popping up as a sort of central figure, if you will, in a campaign when, in fact, according to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, he was a member of a voluntary council that met once, more or less a wannabe in all of this. Where there's smoke, there's fire. But what is this fire? This fire has nothing to do with Russia and the election.
It has everything to do with it. There's a saying on my refrigerator: when nothing makes sense, it all makes sense. The story here is Papadopoulos, because Papadopoulos, Russia, influence, and most important, how is it that we didn't even know that Mr. Papadopoulos had been arrested, let alone that he'd been cooperating for a very good reason? When the government doesn't want you to know because they're actually going somewhere, you ain't going to know.
So on Friday, Mueller leaks that there's going to be a big announcement today. In the meantime, they arrest and indict someone who pleads guilty, and they hold that back from the public. So don't you find something wrong with the idea that you have Mueller's committee, his leaking information that they want to leak to perhaps sway public opinion and not leaking other things, particularly this, which you think is important, but I don't see this guy as anyone significant. No one in the campaign even hardly remembers him.
The hallmark of cooperation is building up and up and up. Papadopoulos may have been real low. He's already pleaded guilty. We know he's been cooperating. Now Mr. Manafort is next. He knows a bit more. Why splash an indictment with all the money that Mr. Manafort spent? Who cares? It's irrelevant. But what is relevant is who's next above Manafort, above and beyond. It's Halloween, and the haunted house here is actually 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. You have FBI agents that are going to be jumping out from behind the walls now.
Speaking of Halloween and the scare tactics Randy's throwing out there, I hear where he's coming from, but I'm not afraid, and I don't think that Donald Trump is either for it, and I'll tell you why. Papadopoulos, really an insignificant wannabe figure here. Paul Manafort, again, yeah, you go and you trace this back to a situation that goes a decade before the election itself.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's hardly unsurprising that Paul Manafort was actually charged. Heck, they raided his house this summer. But as you pointed out, nowhere in the 31-page indictment on Manafort does it allege anything about Donald Trump or Russian collusion. As with Papadopoulos, both Manafort and Papadopoulos should be seen in the same light. The one thing I will agree with Randy Best, this is what we call legal flip bait. What they're trying to do is squeeze both of them to get to Donald Trump. The problem that they don't understand is there is no there there. And frankly, Randy, the idea that Papadopoulos, I agree with you, he's a small fish who no one can remember, but honestly, he pleaded down to lying to federal agents. What is that, 6 months and a $1,900 fine? You got to be kidding me if you think you're going to take down Donald Trump with that nonsense, and particularly when we should be talking about Tony Podesta and the Democrats who actually did. Well,
we're going to talk about that later in the show, but I do want to ask you, Randy, Sarah Huckabee Sanders saying that is her sense that this is winding down. You talked about the amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of pressure that was on Mueller in the last couple of weeks. I always felt that, to Ford's point, this was low-hanging fruit. They had a box in his office. In case of emergency, break glass. It said Manafort. Where do they go from here?
Well, let's be very clear on something. Mr. Manafort's guidelines, without sneezing too hard, right now are about 10 years. They're about 120 months, and they're going to go higher than that. And you know what? Maybe 6 months. I wouldn't want to spend 6 months in a jail. The point is, it is the other people that haven't been charged yet. I can promise you there are people out there, every time a Ford Crown Victoria drives by their house, they're having heart failure.
But I will say this, Randy, you're basically wholly squeezing someone, and I understand how prosecutorial tactics work. You're wholly squeezing someone else for another crime just to get something that may not actually be there. And eventually when you do this,
John, let me bring John in for a second, because, John, real quickly, where do you see it going from here?
Well, I think the big question is, what does Paul Manafort know and what can he give Robert Mueller and his team? So I think there are certainly going to be more indictments. We don't know who, but I think there's more to come. I think that the names that we're seeing today are people who are, in one case with Papadopoulos, already cooperating, and in terms of Manafort and Gates, inevitably will be cooperating. So I think there are going to be more charges. Okay. I don't know how high up it's going to go, though.